But I think it's interesting to think of it in those terms, and then to see what's happening to families and the destruction of the family um, for economic reasons. It's really kind of it's really something else, you know. And then back to your question, David, about is it really that surprising that we're not that really that free in a Christian sense in the United States, right? So it depends on what the definition of freedom is, right? And we think freedom is to be free to indulge in your passions, to drink however much you want to drink, to engage in sexual congress with whomever as much as you want. The true Christian sense, freedom is tied to obedience, and the individual is tied to his community, his church, his family. Right, so there's a juxtaposition, and there's a relationship between the individual and the community that's paramount, and there's a relationship between freedom and obedience that's important. That's completely lost in our sense of freedom here. We're barely tied to have any kind of civic responsibility in our local communities, let alone being obedient to a church or even a family. And I think when you see the destruction of the family by removing fathers, you're seeing the father is the head of the family, right? It is and as the anchor in a sense. Removing that, you're going to have chaos kind of ensue there. But I think it's important to understand this relationship between freedom and obedience, freedom and discipline. And I think when you see this fascist, governments, right? Fascia, the fascia is a term. Your body has fascia. It's that kind of a system that holds your muscles together. So it's fascist is something that binds a people, right? You need to be bound by something, right? If it's not a god, it was a nation that you could be proud of. But once you lose all those ties, you have nothing that binds you. And now, anytime we're talking about some kind of collective identity of being an American, you're automatically called a fascist. It's like, okay, fascism can become rigid and become calcified and become tyrannical. Yes, that's the case. That doesn't mean you get rid of, just like hierarchies become corrupt, you don't get rid of hierarchies. It's impossible. Right. So you need something to bind people, right? Culturally, at the highest level, from my perspective as an Orthodox Christian, it is the God, right? And then from there, you have a fractal binding of a people from a nation to a state to a local community. But that's all got to be bound up in boundaries that are succinct, that have sovereignty in relation to each other. Getting rid of those boundaries is chaos. Right. And I think it goes back to our discussion of the destruction of a border. Like, David, I sent you that video of a close up of a cell disintegrating. And how does the cell disintegrate? It disintegrates at the border first. And it showed a very high def video of the border dissolving. And then eventually the cell dissolves and just becomes chaos. So you have to have a border. It's not a fascist thing to say you should have a secure border. But anytime you talk like this, people with bad intentions and in bad faith, they're going to say, oh, you want to not allow anybody to get in. You want it to be a white nationalist. No, that's not the case. You need to have a border. It needs to be meaningful in order for an identity to exist. And that identity needs to exist among other identities. And only then can you have the question of how to treat an illegal immigrant or a refugee. You can't treat them if you don't have an identity. You don't have a system to allocate resources appropriately. If that's gone, the question of how do we treat refugees becomes meaningless, because there's no there to treat a refugee, if that makes sense.